in recent years, through the concerted efforts of government agencies, police forces, human rights activists, feminists, religious groups, and celebrities, human trafficking has been turned into one of the biggest issues of our time, and I doubt anyone in this room will have missed that. It's often referred to as a modern-day slave trade. But overall, this kind of sprawling network of self-described modern-day slavery abolitionists is not really motivated by solidarity with migrants. Anti-trafficking is not about safeguarding migrants' rights. Instead, it provides a politically correct framework for clamping down on free movement. In fact, today, I would say that the anti-trafficking industry is the biggest threat to migrants because it undermines migrants' liberties and because it warps the public's perception of immigration. So how does this happen? Well, the first thing I think is important to point out is that this label, trafficking, is really quite a confusing umbrella term that has come to cover diverse means of and motivations for moving. And since it took root in global crime prevention and human rights advocacy circles, it has only helped legitimize tightening migration controls, and all in the name of human rights protection. So, we've seen how governments around the world are responding to trafficking fears by restricting the movement of women in particular, by increasing surveillance of foreign nationals, by raiding workplaces, rounding up migrant workers, locking them up in detention centers, and even deporting them, all, it is said, for their own good. And I think another fundamental problem with the official definition of trafficking, as it's outlined in the UN Trafficking Protocol, is that it leaves little room for consent on the part of migrants. In the anti-trafficking lobbyist's mind, when it comes to people from poorer parts of the world, movement is something that's rarely undertaken voluntarily. Instead, it's something that the poor are subjected to. In fact, migrants are often described as being unaware or in denial about the fact that they've been trafficked. So if you take the USAID's recent evaluation report of its counter-trafficking projects in Cambodia, for instance, which I recently read, it explains that USAID, as well as other organizations and researchers, in Cambodia, had failed to come up with any solid figures for the number of trafficking victims in the region. Why? Well, the main reason they listed was because, and I quote, human trafficking victims may be unaware, unwilling, or unable to acknowledge that they are trafficking victims. So I think it's not surprising that the trafficking protocol puts special emphasis on women and children, because they're obviously seen as particularly helpless, clueless, and vulnerable. In fact, the anti-trafficking lobby tends to reduce women to the level of children, constituting them as innocent, easily duped girls. And this is actually quite strange if you consider the fact that the anti-trafficking world is made up to a large extent of people who describe themselves as feminists. And as far as I know, feminists have traditionally fought for women to be regarded as autonomous, free-thinking individuals, not as clueless victims. But in the anti-trafficking lobbyist's mind, migrant women are not resourceful adults moving abroad to earn money or to have new experiences. They're tragic victims or potential victims of abuse who should stay home and accept their lot rather than take a risk by moving abroad. There's no denying that many migrants do indeed put themselves at great risk by taking roundabout and sometimes dangerous routes across the world. Many pay hefty fees to middlemen. Many take up work in the so-called shadow economy once they reach their destinations. There's no denying either that many migrants, men and women, end up working long hours for very little pay and in degrading conditions. And of course, such exploitation should be combated. But my point is that the only way to do so is by opening up legal means of movement and work for migrants so that they don't have to put their fates in the hands of strangers. So that a non-EU citizen wanting to work in the UK, for instance, can simply jump on a plane, like most of us in this room could, and go to an employment agency and find work when they get here. Instead, they have to use informal and probably illegal ways of migrating and working. I don't doubt that most people who work with counter-trafficking have very good intentions, but we all know where roads paved with good intentions can lead us. So the anti-trafficking industry, I believe, needs to be more honest about the agendas that have been tacked on to counter-trafficking. And these agendas do include migration control, and they do include abolishing the sex trade. Anti-traffickers also have to take responsibility for the image they've painted of immigrants and how that has affected how the public relates to foreigners in places like the UK. The numerous and often, I must say, overly alarmist reports about trafficking give the impression that slaves can be found in every sector of society, among sex workers and caterers, amongst contract cleaners and carers, and the list goes on. And these campaigns ask us, the public, to be vigilant against slavery, to report suspicious foreigners. We're effectively encouraged to view all dark-skinned or Eastern European people with suspicion because any foreigner we come into contact with, whether we're sleeping with them or hiring them as cleaners, might be a slave. So just to conclude, what I'm suggesting is that the only sure way to promote solidarity with migrants and to prevent exploitation is to extend as far as possible the right of people to move across borders as they see fit. No matter how well-intentioned, as a whole, the anti-trafficking lobby has promoted a risk-averse notion of immigration as dangerous and threatening, both to migrants themselves and to the host countries. They've helped legitimize migration control, surveillance, and deportation as some kind of humanitarian acts. And finally, I think it's important that we remember that migration, even if it's undertaken by people in circumstances that are not of their making, remains an inspiring expression of human agency. People take great risks in traveling to foreign places in the pursuit of a better life. No matter how well-intentioned, in labeling such movement as trafficking or slavery and demanding tougher border controls and police-led rescue missions, the anti-trafficking lobby has become the greatest threat to the people it's purporting to help.
As the name of the organization suggests that I work for Anti-Slavery International, we work against slavery, and we have been doing so for quite a long time. We were founded in 1839, so our history goes back to the original abolitionist movement. And I think one of the issues that we need to be very clear about is, what is it we are fighting? And are we honest about what we are fighting? And I think very often the trafficking agenda or the anti-trafficking agenda has been hijacked by many issues, and trafficking has been used as a way to fight prostitution, irregular migration, illegal employment, and what have you. And I think what is very interesting is that this year, and actually it's a couple of weeks away, we are celebrating the 10th anniversary of an international convention that Nathalie was mentioning. And there is also a lot among activists looking back at the 10 years, what have we achieved? And you will find a lot of people who were very active in trying to negotiate the convention and trying to find an internationally recognized and a common definition of trafficking, who are very unhappy with what has happened over the past 10 years. And a lot of the anti-trafficking activists are actually calling for deconstructing the anti-trafficking movement and deconstructing the framework. So I would not agree with Nathalie that there is something, a homogeneous lobby, anti-trafficking lobby, because that's by no means the case. But it is true that there has been a lot of unintended consequences, and that there has been a lot of problems with the anti-trafficking framework, in particular the way the governments have used it or misused it to control migration or to control irregular workers. I think we would not deny, and we know that there is slavery in the world, and the areas of slavery we work on range from the traditional slavery that is still remaining in a lot of parts of the world, all the way to the different forms that we have seen changing over the past 10, 20 years. And of course the question is, do we need, or did we need, a new discourse? Couldn't we have used just the original definitions from early 20th century? We very often would argue that the definition of forced labor, if it was properly implemented and properly applied and relooked at from the perspective of 20th century, would have been useful and would have been enough. However, what we have now is anti-trafficking legislation. We've got conventions. We've got conventions that focus on crime prevention. We also have conventions that linked trafficking into human rights framework. And I think that's something we really need to work on. And that's something that certainly we and our partners across the world are trying to focus on, is to make sure that the agenda that has been hijacked into sort of the more controlling and restrictive agenda is actually taken back into what we are talking about. We are talking about severe forms of exploitation where human rights of people are violated, but not only human rights of people are violated, they are also not then empowered and given the opportunity to fight for their rights and given access to justice and being accepted as those who are claimants of rights. And very often, I think the word victim has been misused because in the traditional sense, victim is a word that is used in criminology, talking about people who have been victims of crime. And as victims of crime, they should have certain rights. And that's not something that we see in anti-trafficking very often. And that's also mainly because trafficking has traditionally been understood in connection with sexual exploitation, although it's not just trafficking for sexual exploitation. And the work I have been doing certainly focused on trafficking outside of the sex industry and specifically looking at forced labor outside of the sex industry. Because if you start looking at men, women, and children who are exploited in other industries, you'll find that actually probably more people than those who are trafficked for sexual exploitation. And that goes back to what can we all do about buying very cheap goods and starting to ask whose labor has been used to produce your very cheap clothes. But that's going maybe a bit too far. So I think what we really need to be looking at is, first of all, what are the rights of the people? And if they have been violated, how can we assist them to, or empower them to become activists, become advocates for their own rights, and provide access to justice. Secondly, what we need to look at is any of the unintended consequences or the collateral damage, what is very often described as how have the anti-trafficking measures affected negatively various groups, and do they have adverse effect on human rights? Because another thing that the governments have learned very skillfully from activists is to use the human rights language. So if you look at policy documents, if you look at governmental representatives, they all would be talking about human rights approach, victim-centered approach. But the policies never say what does it mean in practice and how do they measure, how do you measure success? And that is very problematic. And finally, what we need to look at is that a situation of a person at work is rarely static. So you would have a continuum of, let's say, exploitation that ranges from decent work to forced labor. And yes, we might be talking about, in our work, we would be looking at the most extreme situation that is on the extreme end of the continuum where people are in forced labor and where people are severely exploited. But along the line, there are people who might be exploited or who might be in a situation where they are subject to violations where, let's say, labor laws are being broken, but because they do not fit neatly into a category and their status might be irregular, they have absolutely no access to anything. And I think that's where a lot of the policy has been problematic, because while people are in a situation that's changing and it's not static, policies and the definitions very often try to label people and put them into one category or another. So you are either a victim or you are not a victim, and you get entitlement to something maybe, and you don't get entitlement to anything because you haven't been exploited enough. And that's problematic because, as we all know, if there is an environment that allows for lesser forms of exploitation, there will be an environment that will allow for more extreme forms of exploitation. And if people are unable to, for example, claim unpaid wages because they have been irregular, of course there will be people who will very skillfully abuse that situation.
Well, for me, the fact that the Battle of Ideas has to have a trafficking debate confirms that there has been a huge setback for women. Not because so many women are exploited, but because so many women have been willing to accept the story that Natalie alluded to, that vast numbers of women are being rounded up and enslaved. There seems to be something going on in the world in which that it would be acceptable for people to imagine that hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of women are unable to choose anything about their lives at all. Now, 50 years ago, I'm looking around, and maybe I'm the only person in the room that remembers 50 years ago, but you all have some kind of impression about the 1950s, which was considered now would be considered a very retrograde kind of period, in which women were meant to stay at home after being great heroes in the war and working and having full agency and not having to be mothers, were now positioned as domestic angels who would take care of the family and who would be pure kind of vessels of motherhood. And the feminists from that period argued that that was a very old-fashioned, unfair way to look at women, and that women should have equal rights and options to leave home, to get jobs, to not have to have children, to not be secondary to men, to be assertive. I was taught to be assertive, to take responsibility for my own life, and to figure out what you liked about sex. That was one of the things, was that sexual experimentation and not having to be this mother and domestic woman, those were really big things. So now we've got feminists pushing a model of feminism that's worse than that one, in my view. It's worse. It's arguing, and I'm sorry that Julie Bindel isn't here because I wanted to talk to her about it. The argument is that women are inherently sexually vulnerable, that there's something about the biology of women that makes them liable to be penetrated in a dominating, invasive way, that there's something inherent about having a vagina instead of a penis that makes you vulnerable to attack and abuse. There also seems this kind of feminism is pushing an idea that somehow women are unable to weigh options and are sort of predisposed to be pushed around by anyone from their father to the lover boys or the whatever. It's an unbelievable kind of pushing women back into the past. The other idea that's inherent in this kind of feminism is that if you have sex without love, it's a complete disaster. That you will be abused. If you are abused somehow, then you are damaged for life. That you will not be able to recuperate. So that when poor men leave home and get into trouble, wherever they came from in the world, there's a general expectation that they will surmount obstacles. And there is no such assumption about women. It is assumed that they will immediately be completely smashed and put in chains and have no ability to manipulate or negotiate their way out of those situations. I think it's unbelievable that people are falling for this. And if they are young women, then the next accusation is that they are being robbed of childhood, that there's some wonderful innocence. And the idea that people don't realize that in poorer places where you have only a few options, this is not about beautiful neoliberal choice. It's about having a few options and weighing them and deciding which you prefer. So it is not about choice. It is about, okay, I could be a live-in maid, I could sell oranges in the street, or I could sell sex. I'm going to try selling sex. I'd like to see if I could make something of that. So does that ever go wrong? Sure. But try being a live-in maid. That is at least as bad a job as selling sex in a lot of these situations. And people are imagining that somehow, well, since there's no sex involved, which is a lie, a lot of the maids have to have sex with someone, that somehow this is an acceptable job. This is the worst kind of neocolonialism. the idea that this would be coming out of the West, looking at women, particularly women, poor people in the non-West as slaves or potentially slaves. It's as though everyone is almost a slave, with these images from 200 years ago scaring us to death that slavery is back, that civilization is coming to an end, that it's all going to fall apart. This is a huge move to the past, with women seen as chattels moved around by men. And built on top of this great idea is a huge industry, which I unwittingly named the rescue industry in this book, and which has, it's borne out that it was a metaphor at the time when I wrote this. This is 5 or 6 years old now, when I wrote it originally. But it's a gigantic industry. So the amount of money that's going into these kind of rescue operations and the number of governments that think they have to, even tightening all other budgets, oh, but we have money to go raid brothels in Cambodia. It's unbelievable that that some kind of criminal model in which police officers, this is all positioned as criminal. So, yes, you are a victim of a crime if you really are a victim of a crime. And so then there's a criminal, and then so you have a perpetrator and a victim, and you also create the need for someone to come and rescue you. And since it's a criminal framework, those people are police. And so stupid, horrible, violent, upsetting raids are taking place all over the world to rescue brown women from brothels, who then get taken to police stations where they won't denounce anyone and want to be left out of it. So it's a gigantic kind of narrative about somehow the West's way of living is the best one, and we will go police the world and save all the women from this kind of stuff. And as I said, I see it as a big step backward for women. Thanks.
I must have missed something, because if I look at the global economic scene, gosh, women are running that equally with men. If I look at the global political scene, gosh, women are running that equally with men. If I look at countries like Kosovo and the Congo, I guess it's a myth that women are being raped there collectively as an act of war. Indeed, I have no problem with free migration and free borders. That is not the problem. What is the problem is global capitalism exploits the world. What we're moving from is not neoliberalism. We are moving back to feudalism. Make no mistake about it. That is what's actually going on. And these people, it fascinates me. If you have seen, as I have in a case that I did, 3 small Chinese women folded up in the trunk of a car, yes, they were voluntary migrants. They came from a province in China where there's been a history of migration for many, many years. Yes, they were voluntary. The kinds of risks that they had to go through to get to this country, the people that they had to pay to get to this country, the debt that they and their families incurred, yes, I do think that's criminal. Yes, I would prefer them to get on a plane and come here. That's not the problem I see. What I see is the global exploitation, particularly of women. Women form something like 80% of refugees under UN statistics, and they are vulnerable. Gosh, I hadn't heard of men being collectively raped in war zones, but I have with women. And it's fine for me to sit here in the West saying that these things, we're all autonomous, we've all succeeded, it's all wonderful. It's not. The West is exploiting these countries. Women are being trafficked, they are being treated as slaves. And to pretend that somehow we in the West have no responsibility to A, recognize that problem, and B, try and help that problem is to me extraordinary. It's as if we can just, they're poor, so of course they want to work in brothels and get HIV. Look at the HIV rates in Thailand. Thailand was turned into a knocking shop by the US forces, who'd used it as a recreational place for their troops in Vietnam. Thailand doesn't have a history of widespread prostitution. The US imported it. Thousands of Thai women die from HIV every year, and we're meant to turn around and say, oh, that's a kind of free market choice. Isn't that fun? Just like it's a free market choice for the poor to sell their organs to rich Westerners. It's absolute nonsense to talk. I don't talk in terms of choice. I talk in terms of exploitation. And we have to recognize, I think, in the West, our huge responsibility. We have failed to give women equality in the West. We have failed to achieve it. Anyone who says otherwise, just look. When you have the G20, the G8, apart from Angela and maybe one other, who are the other women there? This is after so-called 50 years of feminism. Trafficking is a problem. I don't know the answers to free migration, but I do know that we should be fighting against global exploitation of women and fighting to help women who want to. What little girl, and I'm sorry, I disagree with it. I don't care whether she's poor and brown or poor and white. What little girl says to herself, oh gosh, what do I want to be when I grow up? I know I want to be a sex worker. I'm sorry, I think it is patronizing. These are choices that are so-called choices that are not choices. These are things that women who are desperately poor and hungry and suffering take up because they have little other choice. I think helping those women, I don't sneer at the idea, so-called rescue. I think helping those women to a better place from their perspective of making them economically independent, I cannot see anything wrong with that. So as far as I'm concerned, human trafficking is a problem. It's rich exploiting poor. Rich people don't get trafficked. Poor people do. That's the difference. Rich people do fly into the country. It's absolutely true, business class. Poor women end up in the boots of cars, very often exploited and having to pay huge amounts of money to the people who bring them. I think that's wrong. Simple.
I think that some of the points that were raised are really interesting, but obviously I think that maybe little girls will think, oh, I want to grow up, I want to go into the sex industry, but I think that the main issue is that they choose to do this because it's better than anything they've got, other options. I mean, I saw a documentary where there was women in Thailand and they felt forced to go into the sex industry because they had to work so hard in rice fields just to get any food to feed their families. And so the idea that's going in my mind is, instead of just thinking, oh, what can we do to get women out of these immediate situations that they're in, what about trying to improve the situation in their country, or allowing them to move freely out of their country to be in better situations if we feel that what situation they're in now is so much worse?
If you're going to oppose trafficking, any kind of trafficking, sex trafficking or trafficking in other industries, surely you have to recognise that the exploitation of people in this way is the result of a lack of openness of our own borders, and which enables and facilitates this exploitation and the immigration controls that are in place that are enforced. And Margaret, you said that rich people don't get trafficked, poor people do. And actually, our points-based immigration system absolutely reflects that. Rich people are allowed to come into this country and poor people are not. If you want to oppose trafficking, you absolutely have to support, logically, as far as I can see, open borders. You have to support the free movement of people so that this can't happen. So I'd like to hear from the rest of the panel what they think about that.
What I was quite interested in is I think it's really interesting not to victimise women and to think about free choice. But I've looked quite a lot at the sex tourism industry. It's sort of something I focus on. And what has been problematic for me is when we talk about free choice, we still have to think about how choices are constrained. And I'm quite interested in looking at discourses of race and gender, especially coming out of the West, and discourses that I think we're still invested in that really constrain free choice. For example, I like to think about where the demand for the sex trade is coming from. I like to look at that not just with women but also men.
A view from the panel there was that a victim of trafficking, the term victim is misused. Well, I don't see how the term victim is misused. I mean, within Europe, there's a principle of free movement of goods and people, but they're separate things. People aren't goods, goods aren't people. You can't just traffic people. If you traffic, you surely you are a victim.
The idea that this is sort of some kind of funny choice, I'm sorry, but if you're between 12 and 15-year-old, far away from home, servicing 15 to 20 strangers a day for no money, that is not a fun, oh, I'm going to choose to shag choice, and it really makes me angry. I want that young woman to have the same opportunities that I've had. If that means free borders, fine, I've no problem with that. If that means the end of global capitalism, I have absolutely no problem with that. You know, but don't let's pretend when we're professional, safe women in the West that in some way these women are making an informed, happy choice that we, if we were in their situation, would of course be glad to make. It's not true.
In the 19th century, Josephine Butler wanted to save all women who were becoming prostitutes. And the famous thing that she said was that if she had to be a prostitute, she would be crying all day long. And when I have people with those kinds of responses now, I usually say, it is well known that many people find the thought of doing this absolutely appalling, and they would be crying all day long, and they should stay away from it. They should stay very far away from it. But everyone does not feel the same way about sex. And it turns out that I know this after doing research, not ideology stuff. I started as a person in Latin America doing research with migrants who had two choices. They knew that they could be a maid or they knew that they could sell sex. And do they really know what it's going to be like at the other end? No, no one ever really knows anything. But it is not this extreme kind of idea. There is enormous diversity amongst people who end up doing this stuff. So if you always take the figure of the 12-year-old who was in chains, we will all agree that that's the worst thing you can possibly imagine. But the enormous number of people are in more ambiguous situations, and there is enormous amount of ethnographic work. There's hundreds of studies by now all over the world that show that, yeah, and I repeat, it's not about wonderful free choices. It's about having a few options and ending up preferring one to the other, and some people adapting to it or not. I went over time so I didn't say the stuff about migration policy that I was going to. I don't automatically espouse something called open borders because I'm not sure how that would work. But I'm clear that this is a conversation that needs to be about migration policy and the fact that highly skilled migrants are the only ones that are apparently valued when there are so many jobs in non-prestigious, so-called non-skilled jobs available, which constitute the pull factor for the people from all over the world who know that they can work in the back of a kitchen or as a maid or in construction or agriculture in Europe. And as long as none of those are available for having a work permit, then the idea of migration policy as only wanting good people highly skilled people is the cause of the fact that so many people are constructed as criminal or exploited or whatever. It seems to me that there would have to be a lot of different kinds of models, not one huge thing called open borders, but maybe we could try some different kinds of policies.
The situation is a bit more complicated than just opening borders. I think what we certainly do in our work is to campaign for regular migration, labor migration channels that would be actually corresponding to the needs of the labor markets, because the labor market is very clear. There is a shortage of labor in certain industries, which is unfortunately not met by the migration management policy, and that's where that's where the problem is, and that's where we get all the skilled migrants and those who are most needed by the various industries are not able to come, so there are others who come into place to facilitate that. But I think it is more complicated than that. You have people who are in situations of exploitation who are not irregular. There is a huge amount of people who are within the EU, who are EU citizens, yet they still end up in exploitative situations, despite the fact that they do have the same rights as everybody else. There are also people in slavery who are in slavery in their own countries. So it's not open borders are not an answer or the only answer to exploitation. And I think what we need to look at is, one thing is the freedom of movement for labor, but also the freedom to stay at home and to have opportunities and options at home, because a lot of people would not choose to migrate for work if they had the opportunities and if they were able to survive where they are. So I think that's something we really need to look at, and we should not expect that everybody wants to move away from home to work. They don't, but very often they do because there is no other opportunity. Going back to the misuse of word victim, and I think where it has been misused is in constructing what a perfect victim looks like. And very often what you would see is particular women that are victims of exploitation. Very often the perception is that it should be a battered woman that is crying in the corner. It should not be a woman that is actually starting to ask for her rights, that is angry, that doesn't want to cooperate because what she wants is a viable option. And I think that's very difficult to understand, because the discourse has reduced people into passive victims and expects people to be passive victims, not adults that exercise their agency. Setting aside the fact that a lot of people don't feel like victims. They feel very often, they would feel, I'm a migrant worker and something has gone wrong for me. Yes, I might be a victim of crime, but there is no other offer that is coming to me from the government that has rescued me from that situation. So actually, what I will just choose to go underground and work irregularly, because that's at least something for me. That's at least some sort of an income. Whereas giving a statement against my employer is only going to bring me a deportation at the end of the process, and that's not why I have come from, why I have came here. So,
I mean, first of all, I think we have some pretty good news for anti-slavery, which is that slavery was abolished 200 years ago and it has never returned. It doesn't exist today. And in fact, it's a great disservice to history, to the people who lived through slavery, and to the people who are facing exploitation today, to conflate these two things, because they're two separate things. And, it's not part of one historical continuum. And actually, the trafficking discourse, the problem with the trafficking discourse is that all these things get conflated together, things that are part of history, things that are part of the present. And I think the presentations on the panel have shown this. We've heard about everything from, sweatshop and our consumption behavior in the West. We've heard about women being raped in the Congo as part of the civil war there. We've heard about sex tourism. We've heard about the problem of HIV/AIDS. Everything somehow has to do with trafficking. And really, it makes it impossible to address any single one of those issues in a proper way when everything gets blended together in this umbrella term. That I'm glad to hear that the trafficking lobby, yes, I have referred to it in a very general term, but I'm glad to hear they're starting to deconstruct it, as they say, and that they're problematizing it, and that they realize that they've done a lot of damage to a lot of people around the world by kind of painting a picture of the world in this very moralistic black and white terms, where we have abusers, those dodgy kind of foreign men, we have the victims, the helpless foreign women, and we have the rescuers, the benevolent, anti-slavery abolitionists on a kind of moral crusade to save the world. And if we have a problem with Western meddling in other people's affairs and Western intervention, that's a very problematic Western intervention indeed. And I do agree that it's really disturbing, this obsession with poor people's, people in the third world and their sex lives. And it's, I think WORLDwrite has coined it a missionary position in the past, which I think is very appropriate for this debate as well. And I think that really needs to be challenged. The thing about people are not goods. I mean, I totally agree. People are not goods. They're not commodities. They're human beings with, feelings and all the rest of it, and they have an impact on the societies in which they move in, and that's why I have a problem with the sort of free market argument for free movement, which treats people as goods and which lets people in or out, or leaves people out according to their value to sort of the economy, or in a kind of very utilitarian way. And that's why I think it's a great mistake, as my colleague here suggests, to line up migration policy with the needs of the labour market, because that's actually what's been done through the points-based system, and we've actually ended up closing out vast numbers of people who should have the right to come here and work.
I kind of think that I'm confused about how the words trafficking and prostitution have become interchangeable in media, and how by focusing on the worst case scenarios, the situations of many women are being ignored, and that they aren't, kind of what Laura's saying, I guess. And I don't, especially in the UK media, it's different in Australia where prostitution has got quite a strong voice, where you don't seem to have any balance in the journalism. And I'd like to hear your opinion about that sort of stuff, because... I guess I'm a little bit confused about how some types of feminism, like your feminism, which is based on this concept of economic, disparity, how that reaches the conclusions that find themselves in the Daily Mail. I find that a tragedy of feminism, to be honest, and that's sort of how that's being played out in the media. I'd be interested in hearing what you say.
My name's Camille, and I work with a sex worker-led project here in the UK called the Crosstalk Project, and we've been around for the last 6 years, and we teach English to migrant sex workers. And we started out with a quote from an Aboriginal Australian activist that says, "If you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. If you've come here because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us walk together." And I suppose the thing that my contribution that I wanted to make was I want us to be aware of the desire to help and the desire to save and the desire to intervene when there are other actions that we can support and be a part of, and those involve enabling and supporting people organising for their own self-determination and their own empowerment, and that it maybe it doesn't actually have to involve us. What we have to do is open up the political and the social and the economic space for people to actually organise for themselves. And workers the world over have transformed industries because they've been able to build collective power, and there is nothing about the sex industry there's nothing about the sex industry that I've seen that means that can't also be the case. If we enable the thought process that people are workers and that they understand the conditions of their own lives and how to change them.
To me, dealing with the conditions, giving people more options, open borders will give people more options. And I think that's something that can be campaigned for and should be campaigned for. The other side of it, I think, is problematic, because the idea of punishing and using the law to punish, it does mean giving powers of intervention and investing powers of intervention to Western governments. So you have the use of the powers domestically to stop lots of women, to do raids of brothels, and you find that a tiny proportion of the women that are caught through those raids are then allowed to stay in the country. The vast majority are deported. So it becomes the law's been used as a form of deportation. You get the use of laws like, or the use of external relations in the EU, giving funds to the Ukraine to police the borders, to prevent trafficking, to the Libyan government to act as the border of the EU. And it seems that the use of trafficking and the use of the law is something that's been used to close down options and possibilities for people in the developing world rather than open them up.
Yes, we can all agree that slavery was legally abolished, but it hasn't been eradicated. And I think there is a huge difference between doing a legal abolition or introducing a law, but actually making sure that the law has been thoroughly implemented. And I think that goes back to what you were saying. Laws are way too often used to punish or to restrict rather than to protect. And I think we have seen some very good judgments recently coming, for example, from the European Court of Human Rights that reminds the governments of the positive obligation to protect people's rights and what that should look like. But there are laws to protect human rights. There's a Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There's the whole human rights framework that is available. That's not something that has been used. That has been used to argue in the margins. And I think that's probably something we can use practically more often. And we certainly are doing it in the organization that I'm working on. And I would agree with you completely that the conflation of trafficking and prostitution and the fascination by the media of it is unbelievable. And it's to the detriment of those who wouldn't have been exploited or who are in forced labor outside of the sex industry, because it is not a story for the media to talk about 50-year-old Uzbeki men that were exploited for labor in the middle of a forest in Poland. It has cost them nearly life because they were living in -15 in a cabin, forced to do whatever those who are their employers have asked them to. Passports taken away. They were really treated like modern-day slaves. I mean, there was no difference. But nobody's reporting about it because it's not as sexy, it's not as interesting. So I think we also, and I think a lot of us are also not doing justice to the debate by, again, talking about prostitution. Why can't we talk about forced labor that has nothing to do with sex industry, that has to do with other areas? And I think we need to start introducing that. And I think, we should start talking about men from Tajikistan and Uzbekistan who are in forced labor in forestry in Poland. And that does happen. And nobody's talking about it.
The first thing I'm interested in is basic equality for women on a global scale. I don't see it yet. If you tell me I'm being unfair in saying I don't see it yet, just point me where I'm looking wrong. Yes, one of the problems that women face is places like the Daily Mail and the right very often take up issues and distort them for what they do. That doesn't mean that the basic principle isn't right just because occasionally it gets subverted. All right, you have to look at the basic principle. I'm interested in ending economic exploitation. Yeah, global capital. Hold on. Sorry, can I finish? I'm interested in ending global capitalism, which I see as exploitative. And yes, it's not going to happen anytime soon. Why isn't it going to happen anytime soon? Because the vast majority of people are not struggling against it. There is no ideology countering it at the moment, unfortunately. That's the reality. It's winning. And the more it wins, the more exploitation of the poor will take place. Have no mistake about it.
I think that this kind of conversation, I always feel, well, can we please talk about something else now? So I'm glad that Camille brought up ideas about organizing. I think there's been a lot of silly stuff said about unions and the problem of unions. It's very difficult to unionize, although there are some efforts that have got somewhere in some countries, and not just trades union, but different kinds of collective getting together and trying to get something done. It's very difficult in any country that has a legal framework that doesn't recognize any kind of sex businesses, where it's all taking place in the informal sector, so that you can't really go to the police and you can't really object to your boss because that power relationship is really screwed up. So if you accept the diversity, then you could say, okay, well, for the people who are okay about doing this, maybe it would be possible to fix some of the economic ideas so that more of the businesses would be accepted.
The idea that it's like a Daily Mail scare story is completely wrong. It's very much a broadsheet panic. I mean, you can look at The Guardian every other day or The Times or wherever. It's everywhere. It's not just Daily Mail and those kind of unsophisticated Daily Mail readers who want to read these stories and who believe them. The other thing is that the media is also fed these stories from somewhere. And I don't find, I appreciate, I like what Clara said about it, but I don't find that the NGOs are trying to contest it either, because it's also quite convenient. It brings a lot of attention and it helps their campaigns to spread this very simplistic moral message. And the most obvious kind of situation in which this rises is around sports events. every time we have an international sport event, we have thousands of women who never materialize afterwards. But it's always 40,000. Actually, it went from 10,000 in the Sydney Olympics. It got sort of doubled to 20,000 by the time we came to Greece. Then it became 40,000 in Germany, and again in the South African World Cup. So, I mean, it's always this neat, round figure, always the same figure. And what happens is that, and usually that's a result of trafficking victims having been conflated with sex workers. Again, because in Germany there was a circulation of this rumor that mega brothels were being put up to satisfy all these like sex-crazy football fans. And it was said somewhere at some point that they would have space for 40,000 prostitutes, and that got translated into 40,000 sex slaves are being shipped into. There's going to be a sex explosion. That was in The Guardian. There's going to be a sex explosion, or perhaps Independent, in Germany. And it never happens, and these figures never turn out to be true. And it's not like sex workers' lobbies denying them and doing, skewing the figures. It's actually kind of EU bodies and police forces and so on that have the ones that are working to end trafficking in their own reports of the outcomes cannot find the victims that were claimed to be there. So it starts with an official grasping a figure out of thin air. The media grabs it, puts the headlines out, but also the NGOs make use of it.
I want to come back to this point about women being forced into prostitution that we were talking about earlier with Margaret, about having a happy choice. I've got friends, English friends, with the same educational background as me, that are smart business women that choose to do prostitution. And because it makes sense. And they're allowed to do it.
You might remember a story from a couple of weeks after the Haitian earthquake in January of some American missionaries from the Midwest who got caught taking some orphans over the border from Haiti into the Dominican Republic. I don't know if there's a big story here. It was in America, and anyway, so they were put on trial for that, and rightly so. But they were only the ones who got caught. In fact, in the US right now, there are several hundred children from Haiti who were removed in the weeks after the disaster. And they're removed by military, by non-governmental organisations, basically anyone, these planes were going over there with the food and the aid and so forth, and they were bringing back children. There was no attempt, in most cases there was no attempt to get permission for this. There was often no attempt even to check whether they were orphans and get permission of parents. So, right now they've got, a number of these children have been placed with families in America. Others are sitting in homes. They've got no paperwork. They don't even know their names. There's no possibility to trace them back to their parents. But anyway, it just struck me that they call that saving orphans, not human trafficking.
I'm sure those young women, friends of yours, have realised that despite getting degrees and all the rest of it, they're still earning a lot more, less than the young men. Rational choice. I'm not denying that there is rational choice in every society. What I'm against is exploitation, and there is global exploitation going on. We are part of it.
The easy part of rescuing people is the only part that's getting any attention, which is rushing in like cowboys to liberate slaves in brothels. There are some real victims in there. The research that's taking place in those kind of detention centers and homes is completely disastrous about what's happening, because there are no proposals for how to do this famous thing that you do for prostitutes, which is rehabilitate them, and they're getting deported, and they don't want to be in repressive homes. I've visited them that have bars and that people cannot leave, and if they left, they don't have any rights. So you get riots in homes because of people wanting to get out, which is just what they did 200 years ago as well. So if you think that rescue is a good idea, then you need to think through what will be the different steps after the police go in on their horses and round up all the people and take them to police stations where no one wants to denounce anyone.
I think what we all know is that there are a lot of problems, and we haven't talked much about solutions here today. So I think I would like to bring back the idea of self-organizing and organization, and give you a very good example of work that we have been doing with in some of the Indian states, with bonded laborers and former bonded laborers and the trade unions there. And it was very successful to organize the bonded laborers and link the organization with the land reform so the people can self-organize, but they also have a place where they can work on and where they can support their families. And I think that's something we need to look for, not only self-organization and giving people choices, but also giving them space to exercise their choices. And just quickly going back, I think there will be more and more in the media around the Olympics, and I agree with what Natalie said, the whole scare. But I think what people are not asking is, there is a lot of products, there's a lot of services that will be needed, and there is a campaign that's called the Playfair campaign that looks at actually working conditions of those who produce the merchandise and apparel that is produced in and for Olympics. And I think that's something that we can start talking about, is what are the working conditions of people that have produced all the goods that are coming to the Olympics. And you might have also come across some arguments from the police talking about rise in demand for sexual services in the 5 Olympic boroughs that is driven by the construction workers. And my answer to that would be, if the construction workers can afford to go and pay for sex, that's good, because they are probably getting fair wages and they are treated well. But nobody's talking about the working conditions of the construction workers. But then I think, yeah, if they have the money to go and look for services they want to pay for, I think that's a good sign in terms of their working conditions.
The construction work is quite interesting as well, because already, was it 1 or 2 years ago, when it became clear that, you know, we're going to need all these Eastern European workers are coming in to build the sites for the Olympics. There was a big campaign to say, oh, you know, all these construction workers are going to need prostitutes, and so that's going to bring all these trafficking victims who don't have the right to be here. And not only that, you know, they're going to spread all these sexually transmitted infections. So, I mean, these are the kind of dehumanizing terms in which migrants are being spoken about in this type of debate. But I think maybe the last thing I would say is that we always have to keep in mind that if you're working in the interest of other people, in the interest of ending exploitation and so on, you should always do it in terms set by themselves. And I find that the anti-trafficking, you know, as a whole, the anti-trafficking lobby is serving purposes that are not in the migrants' interest, and that have not been defined by the migrants themselves. And so that's the last thing, I guess. Solidarity means helping people on their own terms and not according to agendas that have nothing to do with their needs and aspirations.